one thing that I found very confusing that kind of threw me off is this one footnote on page 298, footnote 19, to this book by Imogen Tyler, Revolting Subjects, published in 2013. I'll just read the footnote. Tyler has developed this as a general purpose category of psychosocial theory. They're talking about the concept of abjection and why they kind of use that in conjunction with the concept of surplus population. This the citation for like where they got that term and why, like the theory behind it that they're drawing on. So Tyler's developed this as a general purpose category of psychosocial theory through a critical engagement with Georges Bataille and Julia Kristeva, distancing herself especially from the latter's reactionary politics. That's it. I mean, it just kind of threw me off because the latter is referring to Julia Kristeva, who I've read a little bit of, and I had no idea that she had reactionary politics. I thought that she was like quite progressive in a lot of ways. She's like delivered speeches at the UN. She does a lot of work around like ableism and that sort of thing. She's kind of like a at the forefront of abjection theory. Georges Bataille, I understand, is like a pretty controversial figure, and he certainly, you could say that he has reactionary politics. I mean, he identified as a communist, but he also like did a lot of weird shit. He's involved in like human sacrifices, allegedly, and like secret societies, and was like all about kind of like he's like a Nietzschean. So Nietzscheanism in political terms is definitely has reactionary tendencies. But I wonder if this is a typo or if there's just something I know about. This is just a small thing that
I am not at all familiar with this Julia Kristeva person, but like, so I can't really comment on whether or not I think that she has reactionary politics, but I do find that that is one of the problems with a term like reactionary is it's a useful term, but it's also kind of vague in the sense of like what it means. Like when you say something's reactionary, it's kind of like you're saying it's problematic. It's like there's probably something there, but also it's kind of like vague what they're actually trying to indicate. And like it's like reactionary from the point of view of whom. So like when I hear someone say something's reactionary without them further expanding upon it, that's kind of a problem to me because it's just kind of like indicating this is bad, you shouldn't like it, but like I need a little bit of detail about why, like what like give me something to chew on in that.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, this is a footnote that I'm focusing on here. Julia Kristeva is a fellow Bulgarian. Just want to throw that out. But yeah, I mean, endnotes are pretty like precise in their terminology. Reactionary definitely has a meaning, and it's like an old term, that has been around for as long as socialism has been around. So it definitely has like a precise meaning. It's conservatism, basically, like anti-progressivism, reacting to new social developments as they arise, and your political inclination is to, or your inclination when these new developments arise is to move back to something in the past rather than try to develop forward dialectically. So it's like an anti-dialectical position. It's against sublation. It's against determinate negation. But yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna look into that a little bit, see if she actually has reactionary politics or if this is just a typo. I feel like it might have been intended to be latter, and in reference to Georges Bataille. I'm also very interested to read that book itself. Like I like abject theory and curious to know more about it.
Yeah, just even though right here in the section we're referencing Endnotes expresses their problems with their use of the term abjection. Now they weren't totally happy with it. It did when it came up very briefly in Endnotes 3. I thought it was an interesting concept, and even again when they reference it here, which again, it seems like kind of a complex concept. Like it's
Yeah.
somewhat tied into the idea of the lumpen proletariat and like the caste offs of society, but it's also more complex than that. Maybe just in the spirit of like completionism, I'll read the main section here that
Yeah.
references it. In Endnotes 3, we termed the social logic of stigmatization associated with such developments abjection, a concept borrowed from Imogen Tyler's recent book, Revolting Subjects. With its in some ways dubious provenance, we were not especially fond of this term, but it seemed nonetheless quite appropriate as a name for certain problematics with which we were grappling. What was useful was that this term named a particular kind of abstract structure in which something is cast off, marked as contingent or lowly, without actually being exteriorized. Particularly a group of people that are objected within society are kind of cast off, but not really. Like they're still a part of the society. They're still contained within the structural logic of the society, but they're in this position of basically being the social equivalent of vomit.
Yeah, I think abject theory has a lot to do with like psychoanalysis. It's really rooted in that kind of theoretical framework, and Endnotes here are using it in a political sense and like expanding on it. But yeah, as it was developed by like Julia Kristeva and I don't know who else is a core like abject theorist. I guess Georges Bataille perhaps, but
Mm.
yeah, it's used to like a vomit is like a part of your body. So you vomit and there's a bunch of like puke lying on the floor, and you have this experience of revulsion, of horror, kind of looking at it because it's a part of your body, it's a part of you, but at the same time it's like cast off. Um, so the surplus population has like a analogous kind of a status of being, you know, part of the social body, is part of the population, is part of society, but at the same time they're cast off. They don't have any place within it. They don't fit into the productive kind of framework. They don't have any jobs. They can't produce surplus value because there are no jobs for them, and therefore they are cast off. And they're cast off. I like in Misery and Debt, which is kind of like the part one of this essay that we're talking about, an identical abject subject, the final essay from Endnotes Volume 4. Welcome to the podcast, by the way. In Misery and Debt, the first part, um, when the author is kind of like describing these processes of technological development and how that kind of process over time results in fewer jobs just because, you know, industry becomes like more labor efficient. He was constantly using this phrase of like jobs being cast off. So it made a lot of sense in that essay, and I liked how he's kind of like using that language of you know, being cast off, like being rejected, not being needed anymore. Like it's just like an inevitable process of the development of capitalism that you know, there are fewer and fewer jobs, and you know, the population at large becomes, or this surplus population just becomes larger and larger over time.
Yeah, it's like, and I mean, as we've explained before, like just use a simple example, like the kind of example Marx would have used back in the day of how this happens. Like, say you had a factory where initially there's like 100 workers employed and they're producing like a certain amount of some product. Over time, like the more the workers produce this product, like probably the more skilled each worker is going to get, the more efficient they're going to get at the process. Just like if you do something enough, you're going to start to notice the little redundancies, the unnecessary steps, like the time-saving measures. Over time, perhaps you initially start with needing 100 workers to produce a certain volume of product. Eventually, maybe you only need 90, 80, 75. So already just through like making the process more efficient, you've reduced the need for like workers in this particular industry. And then with like technological development, which is the main source of creating the surplus population, say you build a machine that can do the work of most of those workers, and you only need one person to operate the machine. And this was obviously what happened in large part during the Industrial Revolution, during like the 19th century, the 20th century, was this process of workers gradually being replaced. So you might replace like 80 workers with a machine that can be operated by one worker, and then most of the factory is unemployed. So now they're considered surplus. You can produce the same amount of product using far fewer people. And in fact, probably like people who are significantly less trained than those workers would have been previously in terms of building the product by hand.
Yeah, and as like a historical process, it's also very tied up in these other concepts of real subsumption and formal subsumption. But rather than going over that all over again, let's back up to the beginning of this essay and kind of try to summarize what it is, what it's saying, because it is largely it's derivative of Misery and Debt. It's kind of like repeating. It's based on a speech that Aaron Beninav, the author of Misery and Debt, who is not credited here as the author of this essay, so I assume that he is like now officially a member of the Endnotes collective. Um, but it's kind of like a clarification of some points, some potential misapprehensions of Misery and Debt that I feel like we may have actually fallen into, or at least I may have been thinking along these lines. Basically, his objection here, the point that he wants to clarify, is that the surplus population does not constitute a revolutionary subject. It doesn't constitute a social subject at all. That's basically it. Like it's not something that we can think of as replacing the worker's identity. We can't think about like organizing the surplus population really, because it cuts across all lines, all sociological categories, and it's kind of like too expansive a category to really, um, effectively constitute a coherent subject that could potentially be, the agent of a political movement or change or anything like that. Basically, when you read about, or when you think about this theory of a growing surplus population who objectively has like a bone to pick with capitalism, is like cast off by it, and in a very shitty situation with regards to value production, then you might be inclined to think that these people would be motivated to do something about it. They would that their status as surplus population might constitute like a coherent identity around which we could organize them in lieu of a worker's identity, which Endnotes have gone to great lengths to argue does not exist anymore. But yeah, the point here is that that is not possible, and there's no such thing as like an identity for this. It's like an objective like status for certain population segments, but they don't really share anything in common. Like surplus population means a lot of different things for a lot of different people. So basically, there's no real possibility of organizing along these lines.
I went and just looked up any reference I could find in those works, in the original works by Marx, to the idea of the surplus population, and just reread what Marx himself had to say about this subject. And one thing that stood out for me, and I think it relates to what we were saying when we started recording about the idea of abjection, about something that's cast off but not really exteriorized. It's something that's put into like a very like base and kind of like disdainful position within the social body, but it is still maintained in the social body. And how this very much applies in Marx's day and today to the idea of the surplus population, where they're kind of seen as superfluous. They're kind of seen as not essential to capitalism in general, but it is still within the interests of the logic of capital to maintain the surplus population. How if you have a large surplus population of people who are generally like underworked, out of work, working menial like service jobs, like basically struggling to make ends meet, who would pretty much jump on any opportunity for something better. That's actually useful to capital because you can sort of pressure the people you do employ, the skilled workers you have employed, because there's always this sort of like implied threat of all of these unemployed surplus populations who are desperate for work, who would work for much less than you, who would just do anything just to have an opportunity for a better life. And because of that, you can keep the wages of the people you do employ lower, because you can always threaten them with this idea that you could just go hire someone from the surplus population. And besides that, occasionally you do have new projects emerging. Like in Marx's day, the famous example was the building of railroads, where if you wanted to start building a railroad, that's kind of a temporary project. It's not an industry that like lasts forever, but while it is happening, while a railroad's being built, you're going to need a lot of workers to do a lot of work temporarily. So in order to make that happen, if you don't want people to just quit their jobs and leave like a lot of other industries hanging, you need basically a large number of people who are just kind of doing not much, doing nothing important. Like maybe they're just working in like a coffee shop or something. They're not doing some job that's seen as essential to maintaining society. So this also makes it in the interest of capital for having a large surplus population, is that if a new project, a new lucrative opportunity does emerge, you need basically a bunch of people who would be employable. And so you keep this large, what does Marx call it? The industrial reserve army, this like potential worker surplus that you can just put to use if the need arises. And that's a big if.
Right. I think it's important to point out here that the surplus population are not necessarily unemployed, which is why it is so difficult to think of them as constituting one like coherent identity that you could potentially organize. But in fact, as Marx himself said, like the surplus population constitutes the unemployed, as well as, as Mr. Benenev is saying in this essay, it also constitutes people who are partially employed, who are informally employed. And I think I think we've read here and in other essays that a lot of people who are in the service sector are very likely we would consider them to be part of the surplus population because they don't have full steady employment. They have, oftentimes they're just making ends meet. They need to have more than one job. Their employment is like highly contingent, especially with like these new like app based types of employment like Uber and whatnot. So yeah, like the surplus population, like in the United States, for example, social welfare is quite bad. And then in other countries, like other lower GDP countries, like outside of the West, uh, welfare provisions are quite bad if they exist at all. So you can't really have like this vast surplus population who is like literally unemployed, not bringing in any income. That wouldn't work. They would all starve to death, and you'd have mass riots or like bread
Yeah,
riots or
it'd be
whatever.
too destabilizing.
Exactly.
Like,
So the surplus population need some form of employment as well as social assistance. Like here in Canada, we're pretty lucky to have like a decently robust social welfare net, as well as in Europe they have the same thing. So we can talk about surplus population constituting people who are in service as well as people who are unemployed, who are on employment insurance, on welfare. They're all part of the same category. But there are other countries where such a thing does not exist. And as well, like just when we say that, like people who are on unemployment insurance or employment insurance, people who are on welfare, they like this goes to the point that these people do not constitute a coherent subject. It's not really like a sociological category. these people are cut across from very different sectors of the economy. Like think about a like an unemployed or temporarily unemployed or like maybe permanently unemployed like oil worker who's like very much part of the middle class, upper middle class, making good money, very like bourgeois, living in like a particular province here in Canada generally. And then think about like somebody who lives in some kind of like urban ghetto, or like somebody on the street who is like receiving welfare or some other form of social assistance. Like these two people live in completely different like geographical locations. They have completely different backgrounds. They're just like fully different from each other, and yet they are still the same, part of the same category that we're using here, the surplus population. But because they are so different, they really have
Yeah,
nothing in common, and there's no real basis. There's no common identity there that they could organize around.
yeah. It's like it becomes obvious that they're like experiencing the same phenomenon when you're doing this sort of like abstract kind of like system level analysis of the process, but like in terms of the actual lived experience, like everything that they've been like taught, everything they've been conditioned to view the world as culturally, like, and just like materially speaking, like maybe one of them lives in like a much like what would be called a much nicer neighborhood. They like eat different kinds of food, they interact with different sorts of person, they might never even meet or know about each other. So like in every like what would seem to be real world way, their experiences are completely different. And in fact, probably like a lot of the cultural like conditioning is telling them to view each other as different, to view each other as uh like a fundamentally, I forget if it's, I think it's in this essay, but there's like a quote somewhere along the lines of like one of the problems of the surplus population and this idea of abjection is like it's a very atomizing sort of process, like where if you're in it you feel like it's something that you don't really want to identify as, you just want to like get back to normal, you want to like get more employment, you want to like kind of like pull yourself back up into like a decent standard of living. And there's kind of this implicit feeling that there's always someone worse off than you. There's like the lumpen proletariat, there's like the true abject, there's like homeless people, drug addicts, like this sort of the specter of the people who are really bad off. And like you definitely don't want to be like those people. So I think like on the whole that really serves to contribute to this kind of like overall sense of atomization, where if you're in the surplus population, no matter where you are in society, you don't really identify with it. It's something you want to get away from. It's something you want to like diminish and reduce and not talk about, and kind of just like get over it and get back to like quote unquote normal living.
I mean, like the idea of like living off of scams, living by hook and by crook, living informally and hustling and like all this sort of thing. It's great. It's commendable. I've been doing it for a long time, or it's someone I know, someone who is not me. But some people live by hook and by crook, and they're able to get by, and that's fine. That's very commendable. That's great, but it is not really like socially sanctionable. Like we can't say that
Yeah.
all of society, the millions, billions of people who are part of the surplus population, should be living by hook and by crook, because that
Nah.
is going to blow up our spot. That is going to, I mean, that it's simply not possible. Like they would
For
catch
real.
on and, you know, like change their policies so that we wouldn't be able to live by the scams that we've previously been living by if millions of
I
people
mean,
suddenly caught on to them.
like, and also just like more, looking at the big picture, these kind of like raccoon-esque, vulture-esque, like scurrying, like living on the outskirts of society kind of lifestyles, as exhilarating as they might be and as romantic as it might be to read like a book about someone who lived like that, like some like beat poet type of shit or something, it doesn't really make for a revolutionary practice, because like
No.
you don't build like a functional large scale society just by everyone gaming the system. Like the best case scenario there in terms of revolution is it would just sort of accelerate the destabilization and collapse of the current corrupt order, and then maybe someone else with initiative would come along and build something better. But
Right.
like, you know, that's also kind of a loser mentality. You don't want to be in that position of being just someone who's like, you know, like pushing over the existing structure and making it collapse. You at least also want to be one of those people who has like some sense of like maybe there could be a better order that comes along to replace this. You want to be building. You don't want to just be like knocking stuff down.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken about this idea of alternativism before, but starting your own like Project Mayhem in some kind of like derelict building on the outskirts of the city is all well and good. I mean, it constitutes as if you actually get to the Project Mayhem level of actually like doing actions, then you're doing adventurism, which is not politically sanctionable. I mean, as an individual, I am not wholly against adventurism, but um, as a political thinker, I cannot sanction it. But setting up your own like little scam commune is a form of alternativism. It isn't really something that can be replicated on a large scale. It is not like a legitimate form of social practice that you can pitch to the masses. Have you seen Fight Club?
I have actually.
Okay.
I watched it like a couple years ago, like, you know, after years and years of seeing it be this like meme that people referenced. I finally got around to watching it, and I had two thoughts. The first was like, oh, hey, this is actually a pretty good movie. And the second thought was like, it's weird to me that this is a meme because the whole film seems to be making fun of the exact sort of people who love this movie. Like everyone who thinks like a
Yeah.
Fight Club would be badass. Like the whole film felt very explicitly kind of like making fun of that and like pointing
Yeah.
out like the problems of that line of thinking.
Well, I think that everybody who like kind of celebrates Fight Club probably thinks that they are, you know, better, that they are like the true one that the film is speaking to. You know what I mean?
Mm,
But
right. Yeah,
yeah,
because like I
go
mean,
ahead.
that's like all of this stuff. Like, because I get it too. Like watching Fight Club, there was part of me that like, man, it sure would be badass to be in a Fight Club. You know, like there is something like this individualistically appealing about all of this stuff. Like the idea of living in like a commune and like I don't know, throwing Molotov cocktails around. Not that I'm advocating for that, or like you know being like this like you know like lumpen proletariat like swindler con man who's just kind of like living by hook and by crook, or even the idea of being like the Wolf of Wall Street, just like being like this like doesn't give a shit badass who does lots of drugs and like makes a lot of money and just lives like a very lavish lifestyle and is like fuck it, the world's going to hell, like I'm just one man, like you know I may as well get mine. Like there is something that's like appealing to the individualist part of my brain about every one of these scenarios, but I can't really sanction any of them. And that's a frustrating position to be in because there's all of this stuff, all of these scenarios that seem really cool and badass, but then if you think about them for like 10 seconds, you're like, well, no, that's not really going to work. That leaves you in this position where you're just kind of like, what do I do? You know, because like if you try to hustle, if you try to work, you're just going to be one of these like exploited surplus workers. If you're just kind of like a you know a vulture kind of like living off the scraps of society, that's like not a good position to be in. And if you try to do something to like sort of like exteriorize yourself, to like radically other yourself, like you know like just going off the grid and being like an anarchist and doing some like Unabomber shit or something, again not sanctioning that, that doesn't really seem like it leads to anything. So like there's always this question you come back to, like, what actually do you do?
Um, but yeah, Che Guevara, he and the RAF, they're like a bunch of like kind of bandits who formed their group. They're like kind of militant fighting group who are like committed to living a clandestine life outside of the system, which is and then they like would like rob banks and bomb military headquarters and like assassinate political figures and whatnot. But they're doing this all like kind of on their own without the real sanction of the masses, without the sanction of the people. They're like
Mm.
they're basically the equivalent of Project Mayhem. They're just a bunch of people who are, had ideas. They had a political program and like a material kind of like strategic or tactical. They didn't have a strategy. They had tactics. They had tactics
Yeah.
of how to fight against, whoever it was that they were fighting against. But they weren't really operating on behalf of, the people, which is very different from if you think of Mao, for example, who, spent like a decade more building up a political base in northern China, and he didn't like just fight his guerrilla war with like a small army of people who are like kind of like committed. I mean, he had an army of people who are committed, but he recruited them from amongst the general population, and like the entire, like basically the population of northern China, like he had it under his control in a good sense. I mean, they're occupied by the like Japanese run and American run. I mean, China at the time was like a proxy state for the United States and Japan. But yeah, so he like the difference there is that he had like a consent of the actual people. Like he had his army that was made up of the people, and then the army represented the general population, including those who are not part of the army. So that is why he was waging a people's war rather than just a war.
Mm.
Um, and that is like I mean, it's really tempting to want to indulge in some adventurism. I mean, we don't sanction it here, uh, but you can feel the immediate pull of it because as an individual, when you hear about injustices like ecological injustice, I think this is actually a big thing in ecological kind of circles. Like eco-terrorism or
Yeah.
eco-activism is like
Yeah.
much bigger than, like, I don't know, like communism terrorism or something like that. But people want to do something immediately with their own two hands, so to speak, and organizing and building or base building and like creating a political movement is not really satisfying in the same way.
Yeah.
This is quite a tangent, but it is worth noting that here in Canada we have a revolutionary communist party that is Maoists, ideologically speaking. They're very split up and fractured. I don't want to get into that, but historically, there's a point in time when they were merely an organizing committee. They did not call themselves a party because they didn't feel like they had sufficient um, they didn't feel like they had a sufficient base to be able to like represent the people of Canada in a meaningful kind of sense. And if they just called themselves a party at that point, it would have been like completely arbitrary. But then, I guess there came a point when they had like, spread across, they had built up enough of a base or whatever. They had representatives throughout the provinces that they felt like they could move from being an organizing committee to being a party. And, I guess they're not really they're like, if you read their literature on their website, then you'll find that they advocate for a people's war in Canada, but they are not at the point of like declaring that. Like, if you go and try to join the RCP, then you're not going to, get to like be a part of some kind of like militia squad with like a gun,
Yeah.
like doing drills and like
Yeah.
bombing whatever, because they still don't have the kind of political representation to be able to do such a thing, to be able to carry out militant actions in a way that would actually be representative of the people, that would be like consented to by people, because like nobody knows about the RCP. So if they were to do something like that, it would strictly be adventurism. It would just be like a
Mm.
bunch of people who are operating on their own basis. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. This as you're describing it, is something I totally get. And it's like when I say I get it, I mean on the one hand I get like the problems with it, but I also get like why it happens and why it's like seductive, and I can like look at my own life and like see like multiple instances where like it's like, oh, that sounds kind of like what I was doing there. Even like at the start of this year, like I read Che Guevara's like guerrilla warfare handbook from like 1960, I believe, at the start of this year. I think it was like the first book I read this year, the English translation of it. And I remember reading it, and I was like, just every page, I was like, oh, this is so badass, this is so cool. Like, just being out in the jungle doing like military drills and like going and like digging trenches into roads and like breaking bridges and stuff to like stop the military vehicles from getting around. There's something like very viscerally satisfying about like the idea of that, especially like if you had this feeling that it was like genuinely going to bring about the revolution and that you weren't just like engaging in like mindless like youthful destruction, like like what so many protests ultimately turn out to be. um and like certainly I think on like previous episodes of this podcast we've talked about like the perils of like just being like an armchair researcher endlessly reading theory and like never actually doing anything. This is like the other end of the spectrum where it's just like you just do something. Don't think about it too much. Just deal with whatever immediately feels like it's gonna like maybe work, and like hopefully it does work. And like there is something appealing about that. It does feel like you're actualizing on an individual level, like you're actually doing something that could theoretically make change. The problem is that it's not necessarily likely. Like what's more or less going to happen if you're just a small group of people engaging in some sort of like terroristic act, for lack of a better term? That's exactly what it's going to be seen as. You're just going to be seen as like disturbing the social order. You're going to be seen as like a disruptor, as like a villain, as an outsider, as like something to be like squashed and controlled. Like I think like, to use the most extreme example, like if it was just like a purely individualistic act, like some young person who like leaves their home in the suburbs and goes and moves to the city, moves into a commune and like shaves all their hair off and gets some tattoos and like, like reads the anarchist handbook and like learns how to make like a pipe bomb and they like, I don't know, they blow up like a parking garage or something. They just do something really extreme that doesn't really serve any purpose. That's not going to bring about a revolution. That's just going to be like an act of destruction. If anything, is
Yeah.
going to like reduce the chances of a revolution happening. So I think in order for that to work, there does need to be like some sort of higher understanding or at least like potential for organizing in a positive way beyond just like the acting out of a frustration. But at the same time, like it can't be too theoretical because like you do need to like do something. So there's this weird balance that needs to be struck where on one level you need to be kind of like have a little bit of that badass energy, that willingness to like take a risk and do something that if it fails, you're going to be seen as the bad guy.
Yeah, the thing is that the risk that people, that I think people need to be willing to take is basically organizing their workplace, which I mean, it doesn't sound sexy or cool. It's not as cool as like blowing up a satellite dish or something, or blowing up like a hydroelectric dam. But like it's risky, and it is, it's something that we can politically sanction, that basically every leftist politically sanctions organizing your workplace. You might get fired, you might get ostracized by
Hmm.
your employees, or your coworkers. And it's going to, if you succeed, even if you don't succeed, it's going to be very constructive. If you succeed, then you have a union. If you don't succeed, then you learn about how to unionize, and you like expose a lot of people to a lot of new ideas. You all develop new experiences, whatnot. But it's not very cool because
Yeah.
it's like a kind of like a long road to just building power. Like it's just a necessary first step. It's a necessary step that I don't even know. Like it's not necessarily necessary, but it needs to be done. Like in order
Yeah.
to do any kind of socialism, like we, the people, need to be building power for ourselves outside of electoralism. And this is simply the best, and perhaps it's not the only option. There are other types of organizations and unions that we can form and participate in outside of the workplace, like tenants unions and whatnot. But it is like the best option that is available to us. It is not necessarily how we are going to do a revolution via trade unions, via workers' unions, but it is absolutely something that needs to be done just in order
Mm.
to like start building power, start like organizing. Like we need to
Yeah.
organize as workers. That is simply all that needs to happen. So we like the absolute necessary thing that we need to do is start organizing as workers, start getting power for ourselves, and then from there we can start figuring out, we can start developing like a greater plan. Maybe we could like start some kind of like democratic socialist party that participates in electoralism, whatever. That is like a fucking moot question that is, you know, still TBD. But
Mm.
in the meantime, like workers absolutely need to start organizing for themselves and start getting power for themselves, start like participating. I don't know. And this is totally against what Endnotes thinks. Like they think that is completely useless because like the workers' identity doesn't mean anything, but it is still where most people spend most of their time. It is still like the easiest and most immediately available avenue for your average, for basically every person who lives in society to, you know, start getting power for themselves is by organizing at their workplace.
Yeah, and I think as you're saying this, it raises a very important point, which like I'm also going to go against Endnotes here because like something Endnotes has said repeatedly in like all of the essays we've read about this, when they talk about like why there can't be any sort of positive like organizational workers identity that emerges from the surplus population today, they like point to this fact that like a lot of like these modern service industry jobs that like millennials and Gen Z people, you know, like people under 40 especially have are kind of just like these bullshit jobs that you wouldn't be terribly proud of, that you wouldn't necessarily want to keep doing for the rest of your life. It's not like being a carpenter or a welder or like an engineer or something like that. So like there is this kind of feeling of like, oh, why would I want to organize like a workers union around that? Like I don't want to be a dishwasher for the rest of my life or whatever. But it's not so much about the job. Like when you organize, like it's like a way of like learning how to organize more generally. It's like the abstract like process of organization, which can't, you can certainly like read about it in books. You can like get a theoretical understanding about it, but like in terms of actualizing it, you need to go out and do it. It's like any other skill. Like if you wanted to become a painter, you could read like all sorts of books about painting. You could like watch all these videos about painting. You could go to art galleries. You could look at paintings, and you'd probably learn a whole bunch. But you're never actually going to improve as a painter until you actually try painting. And chances are, like the first like whole bunch of paintings that you make are probably just going to look like shit. They're probably like not going to look like what you imagine in your head is the kind of painting you want to make. But like you need to do that. You need to like build those skills and learn your own kind of internal intuitive like relationship to the process in order to develop like skills. There's unspeakable aspects to any sort of activity in life that you can only learn by doing them. And it's the same with like organization and like getting a lot of people to come together as like a unit that actually makes something happen in society. Like you can't really do that on a large scale in terms of say like erecting some sort of like communist utopia if you haven't done all the intermediary steps of like learning how to do that on a small scale, like say, you know, like organizing some friends to have like a project or organizing a workplace to have a union. Like even if it's not something that seems like that important or even something that you'd like to retain in the big scheme of things, you're going to be learning how to do this through this process. And I think that's like super important for like, like our generation and younger, especially because like I get the sense that by and large, millennials and Gen Z, like we've been extremely atomized our whole life. Like we haven't really learned like any skills in terms of like starting our own projects and like making our own groups and like actually like creating any formal sort of structure on our own. And like if we want to have any sort of meaningful social change and like stop letting like aging boomers decide everything for us, like we need to learn how to like be able to make our own decisions by coming together.
It's just for the record, Owen is saying all this even though he didn't come to a single one of the union meetings at the workplace that I was organizing. Just for the record.
Really blowing up my spot right now.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
I
Just
was
kidding.
like I was much less of a socialist than
Yeah,
like I was like very much in the hustle mentality when I had that job.
yeah,
The hustle
fair enough.
mentality is seductive. Like this is
Yeah,
I'm gonna tie this back to like this idea of the surplus population. Like you're constantly getting hit with this propaganda from mainstream society where it's like you can be a badass, you can have all this cool stuff, like if you just work hard. And the fact that you don't have that cool stuff means that you're not working hard enough. Like you're a lazy piece of shit. So why don't you
yeah,
just work harder?
I know.
So like I think especially like when you're working and you're in that environment where that's constantly being normalized, like most of your coworkers will be in that mindset. It is very like tempting to fall into it yourself because there's something grounding about hard work, right? Like, if you just go to your job and really like give it your all and like buy into this myth that if you just keep doing that, things will turn out well for you. There's something very comforting about that, even if it isn't really like actualizing in the world, as opposed to something like trying to form a union where there isn't any of that grounding feeling. It's like you're like taking a step into the unknown and engaging in like a risky endeavor, and like society at large is telling you that you're just like being a whiny baby.
Yeah.
So yes, it is true though that I did not I did not do my part the last time it was an
Well,
option for me.
you spoke to me a lot about it. I was able to like bounce ideas off of you and whatnot, and like that helped with the initial motivation of like getting things going and getting things, or just like thinking about things and etc. So that was like a form of participation. But when it actually came to going to the meetings and trying to figure out everything else, yeah, whatever. Anyway, on the topic of terrorism, I was just wanting to recommend a movie that I saw maybe a month or so
Ooh.
ago. It's an old movie. It's called Night Moves, directed by Kelly Reichardt. She's a really great filmmaker, um, like an American independent filmmaker. This movie, I think it came out around 2014, in that kind of period of time. It stars Jesse Eisenberg, Amanda Seyfried, and Paul Skarsgård. I think is how you say his name.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
have you ever heard of it? Have you ever heard of Kelly
I've
Reichardt
heard
or
this film's title, but I have not seen it. I don't know
yeah?
anything about it.
Night Moves. It's yeah, very beautiful movie about a few people who plot to blow up a hydroelectric dam, and yeah, I don't know, somehow for some reason when I think about like politically motivated kind of acts of terrorism, I feel like eco-terrorism is kind of like somewhat different than other forms of terrorism. Just
Oh, totally.
like it seems like it could actually be effective in a way to like an individual act of like blowing up like a key thing could actually have like a meaningful or long lasting impact, whereas an individual act of like, or like an individual group's like sustained actions against some state thing or whatever is, it feels much less likely to have a real impact, whereas blowing up a hydroelectric dam could like change things significantly, could like really
Mm.
significantly affect things. So I don't know. I'm not advocating eco-terrorism either.
No,
Just for the
certainly.
record, we can't advocate any forms of militant action. Like that's off
Yeah.
the table. We can't advocate for
Yeah,
that, and we
definitely
don't. So
don't read any Ted Kaczynski books. Definitely don't do that. Don't download them off the Pirate Bay. Don't share them with your friends.
it's all
Um,
outdated. The Anarchist Cookbook is so outdated anyway. Like it
but
doesn't
anyway,
apply
like
anymore.
just like morally reflecting on the idea of eco-terrorism, I think one thing that makes it feel different, not justifying it, but is like other forms of terrorism. Like if you engaged in like an act of terrorism in the name of like a religion or like ethno-nationalism or like a political ideology, these are all like abstract kind of human created ideas, which like they could theoretically have some real world weight behind them. Like you could theoretically build a society based on any of those things. Like you could have your like religious state or your ethno state. And in theory, it could be like a beautiful culture that produces great works of art in theory. But it's like the problem is that it's always like just this human created abstraction. Whereas like if you do an act of terrorism on behalf of the environment, it feels like you're acting as an agent to something that's bigger than any of these human abstractions. It's bigger than humanity itself. It's like a material thing that you can actually point to. And like perhaps one of the few things that you could actually do like an act of terrorism on behalf of that's actually bigger than humanity. That
Yeah,
isn't just like an idea that we came up with that could theoretically be good or bad.
yeah,
Like the environment itself, like the thing that sustains us and gave rise to us that we need for any of these other things to happen, it does
right.
have this sort of more foundational feeling to it. So I can kind of understand why like it has a bit of a different feeling when we talk about like engaging in certain extreme behaviors, because it is
Right.
like really is like our mother in a very like felt sense.
Yeah, and also, I mean, generally eco-terrorism is directed against like forms of property, and also like especially nowadays, a lot of people really feel especially like younger generations kind of like feel the pressure of climate collapse and I just feel like if you were like depending on the execution like a dramatic act of eco-terrorism is more likely to be have like widespread popularity than like an act of like killing some cops or like killing some military people, like the kind of shit, or like robbing a bank for like your political thing, like the kind of shit that the RAF would do, or
Mm,
that like Che Guevara would do. Like actions against the state, like people are going to be like, oh, those poor soldiers, those poor cops, etc., and focus on like potential human casualties. Whereas with a form of eco-terrorism, like generally you're talking about again like destroying something, a piece of property, and yeah, most people are like kind of on board with climate like stopping global warming and whatnot.
climate stuff is interesting too, because like I feel like a lot of other like progressive movements of the current age, like that people are on board with, that people are generally like, yeah, let's like, push for like racial equality and like LGBT equality and like all of these things, like even if they are felt to be like, someone might feel like they're a very good thing to push for, like it's usually on like this more of like an intellectual level of understanding where it's like you've thought about it and you thought like, yes, it would be good if we had a society that allowed for like this and that. Whereas like environmental concerns, I think they hit people on a much more like, for better or worse, like a much more visceral level where there's like genuine like primal fear of like environmental collapse and like
Yeah,
you or your kids or your grandkids like dying in like a barren wasteland Mad Max environment because
yeah,
like
or living out this week in Texas in the United States,
true,
millions of people without power heating in like
like
sub-zero
that's
temperatures.
very true, but like all that to say like environmental stuff kind of hits differently. Like you might look
Yeah,
at these other things and say like, yeah, that's all good stuff, but like environmental stuff is like that gets a lot of people afraid. Like, you
Yeah,
know, that's on like a whole different level of consciousness, I think.
yeah. As a final word on terrorism, I just want to relate a little bit of thing from my personal life, a little bit of an indulgence. You know, this is my space, this is my show, so I can talk about whatever I want.
This is true.
But right now, I'm writing a novel, and one of the main characters is an adventurist. He's a kind of a communist Batman, is how I'm pitching him.
Nice.
He's a he's like a vigilante. He doesn't have the consent, so to speak, of any kind of major people or anything. He doesn't have the consent of the masses. He's not really. He's acting on the in the interests of the people, but they don't know about him first of all, and he's not really like concerned about interacting with them on that kind of in that kind of way. um but yeah, my justification for his behavior in the novel, he's not going to be like robbing any banks or anything. He's mostly like a kind of investigator, like basically a glorified private investigator who like gets wrapped up in the whole plot of the book. But my justification is going to be that we are at a point when, you know, like as endnotes say, the worker's identity has completely collapsed. Atomization is so entrenched, um, and like the situation is just so dire. There are no prospects for. There's no hope on the horizon really, or on the immediate horizon. um, Things are so dire that every means is justified, including adventurism. So, like this character, you know, he's not really part of any kind of like political organizing. He's not organizing at a workplace, although he kind of is. I mean, he fights on behalf of the working man everywhere, but he's not like building up workers' power in that way. He's kind of acting on his own. It's very individualistic. The main critique against adventurism, as we've been describing it from like the communist left, is that it is bourgeois because it is essentially like an individualistic style of political action rather than like a communal style of political action. But this guy, he's embracing it. Like this is just what needs to be done. Like every means are necessary. He's like kind of hoping that potentially he could like provide a catalyst for, you know, further communal kinds of actions. This, I think, is how the RAF envisioned themselves. They didn't think that they were going to, you know, build up like a big army, but they were part of you know, the general leftist scene in Germany at the time, and they hoped that, you know, through their adventurism, through their individual like militant actions, that they could inspire other leftists to, you know, like rise up and participate in their own kind of militant actions. Um, Anyway, I just kind of think that we are at the like I don't we can't sanction we cannot sanction
Yeah.
adventurism or
No.
terrorism of any sort, and we do not. But at the same time, we are at a point in time when I think that like all means should be taken. Basically, I think that like
Yeah.
anything that you can do, anything that you feel like you should do, that you can do, that you're good at doing, anything that you do that feels good, you know, you should do basically. I don't,
Yeah. Like
yeah, go ahead.
all of this stuff, like pretty much everything that we say, everything that could be said is like a heuristic. It's kind of like a rule of thumb. It's like, this is how it's appeared so far in generally, but like the situation's changing, you know, like, and there always is this potential in something like adventurism. And this is like why I think it has this eternal, like kind of youthful appeal. There's like always the potential that like the individualist, like romantic, revolutionary, artistic, creative act actually will be the one that sparks like a massive social change that resonates throughout history. Like there's like this overwhelming likelihood that it'll just be like some stupid thing that fizzles out and wastes a lot of time and energy. But like
Gets itself killed.
yeah, there's also this understanding though that even though that's like overwhelmingly what's likely to happen, it's also the thing that in rare instances leads to all evolution of life and culture and society in all its forms, is that willingness to take that chance. And like I do feel like in some part that maybe this is an inevitable aspect of life, is that like even though it seems hopeless, there does need to be on some level, again, maybe not actual, maybe more on like a sort of a, like an abstract kind of philosophical understanding feeling level. There needs to be that willingness to take the leap of faith, as Kierkegaard would call it, even if you think something's going to fail, because maybe it won't.
Yeah.
And there's only one way to find out.
There's only one way to find out, folks. And on that note, this has been your Footnotes to Endnotes. My name is Uriah Mark Todorov. You can find me on Twitter at the inverted form.
And my name is Owen Gilbride, and you can find me on the internet at world3.tk. I promise to put content up there eventually.
Yes, if you want more content, then you can send me a DM and get on our Discord. You can also subscribe to our Patreon if you want to support the show, keep it going, keep it ongoing. We just finished Endnotes 4, going to be finishing Endnotes 5 before the summer, most likely.
Probably. Yeah.
We'll have a few bonus episodes in between 4 and 5. What they are is TBD. Stay tuned next week. It's going to be very exciting. But yeah, if you want to keep the show ongoing after we finish Endnotes, maybe you liked this kind of discussion where we barely spoke about the text and just kind of rapped for an hour and kind of, maybe you like that. Maybe you want us to keep going, keep doing this after we finish reading Endnotes, move away from, strictly speaking about texts, but maybe you like our conversation. Maybe you just want it to keep going and you want us to get better at it. You like the show as it is, then you should really support the show financially. Owen needs a new computer. He needs a new computer.
My
It's
computer is from
piece of
like
shit.
11 years ago.
Yeah, and it's broken. It's simply broken. So yeah, please support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the inverted form. Sign up for $3, $5, $10. You'll get access to the Discord, and eventually we'll start producing bonus episodes once some people are interested in the show.
We're gonna get Zizek on here as a guest next week.
Yeah, that's it. Stay tuned for next week. We've got Zizek. The interview is in the can. We're just editing out all his vocal tics.
Yeah,
it's going to be the most. It's going to be the smoothest Zizek interview you've ever heard. But yeah, support us, give us some money. Also, if you want in on our Discord, we're going to be starting up like a kind of semi-regular, just like discussion kind of thing with anybody. We'll all be just talking about, what it is that we have learned in the past week.
It's like
just
it's
talking
a
about
small form of organization.
Exactly.
As millennials, we need to practice what organization we can.
Yeah, so if you want to be part of that research collective, we also have like a thing that I've started doing. It's basically like a group virtual study sessions. You can like, if you have a project that you're working on, come on, we'll work for 15 minutes or 15 minutes, then take a 10-minute break, maybe chat a little bit, then just repeat that 4 times, 4 hours of work in. It's a good way to if you've ever been to school, then you know how effective like study buddies can be. But yeah, if you want access to the Discord, then you can support us on Patreon, or you can just send me a DM on any platform. But yeah, I guess until next time, bye.
Take care.